There's a strange kind of quiet that settles in when you think about the people who are still here. Not the loud, obvious ones. Not the friendships that burned bright and disappeared just as quickly. The quiet ones. The names that don't surprise you anymore. The voices that don't require preparation. The people who have seen you at several different stages of becoming someone else. Sometimes, late at night, you might notice how rare that is. And how unsettling it feels that some connections have outlived things you thought would last forever. Beliefs, defenses. Old versions of yourself that once felt necessary just to get through the day. Some friendships stay, not because they were perfect, not because they were easy, but because they survived something deeper. There's often a familiar pattern around these friendships. They don't need constant reassurance. They don't collapse after distance or silence. You don't have to perform a version of yourself that feels rehearsed. With them, there's less explaining, less proving, less fear that one wrong sentence will undo everything. You might notice how conversations can pause without panic, how disagreement doesn't immediately feel like abandonment, how being tired, distracted, or quiet doesn't threaten the bond. And at the same time, there's something almost heavy about these connections. They carry memory. They remember who you were before certain armor formed, before some habits became automatic, before you learned which parts of yourself needed to stay hidden. Sometimes, being around them stirs an old discomfort, not because they hurt you, but because they remind you of things you survived without fully realizing it at the time. Friendships that last this long often begin before the world taught you how fragile connection could be, before you learned that affection could be withdrawn, before attention felt conditional, before being yourself came with consequences. In early life, connection isn't just social, it's survival. We learn very quickly what keeps people close and what pushes them away. We learn which emotions are welcome, which needs are inconvenient, which reactions are too much. And without thinking about it, we adapt. Some people learn to be agreeable. Some learn to be quiet. Some learn to anticipate others before being asked. Some learn to disappear emotionally while staying physically present. These adaptations aren't flaws. They're intelligent responses to an environment that required them. But they don't always leave when the environment changes. So, when a friendship forms early, before these strategies fully harden, it often knows you without the later layers. It knew you when you didn't yet know how to manage yourself for others, when your responses were more instinctive, when your presence didn't feel like something to calibrate. And when that friendship survives into adulthood, it carries that original recognition forward. This is where things get complicated, because long-lasting friendships don't just witness growth, they witness protection. They see the moments where you learn to hold back. They feel the shifts when closeness became something to monitor instead of trust. They notice when humor started covering discomfort, or competence started replacing vulnerability. And still, they stayed. Not because they didn't notice the changes, but because they understood, even if no one ever said it out loud, that something happened along the way. There's often grief here. Grief for the version of yourself that needed to change to stay safe. Grief for the ease that once existed before emotional caution became second nature. Grief for the friendships that couldn't adapt the same way. Sometimes the pain isn't about what went wrong. It's about what had to be sacrificed to keep going. And these long friendships quietly hold that truth. They don't demand explanations for the adaptations. They don't require you to justify why certain walls exist. They simply make room for the reality that you became who you needed to become. What's interesting is that these friendships don't erase childhood wounds. They don't undo the learning. They don't make the past disappear. Instead, They exist alongside it. They become a counter-memory, a living reminder that not every bond ends when things get complicated, that not every closeness dissolves under the weight of change, that some connections are sturdy enough to carry multiple versions of you without asking you to choose one. They don't fix anything, they just remain. And sometimes, that's enough to gently loosen the belief that everything meaningful eventually leaves. Not by force, not by reassurance, but by presence. If you sit with it long enough, you might notice that these friendships don't feel dramatic. They feel quiet, grounded, almost ordinary. And yet, they hold an extraordinary truth: that something in you was worth staying for, even when you didn't know how to stay with yourself. That some bonds don't survive because they avoid pain, but because they were born before the pain learned how to speak. And maybe that's why they last. Not as proof of anything, not as a lesson, just as a quiet fact. Still here.